Welcome to the land of eternal warnings. Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back more than 3,000 years to a place where kings prepared for death longer than they prepared for life, where priests spoke secret words believed to control the universe, and where disturbing warnings were carved into stone for anyone foolish enough to disturb the dead. So grab a blanket, settle into your favorite chair, and let's spend some time wandering through the shadowy corridors of ancient Egypt. And as always, before we begin, remember to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy these long historical journeys. Now, lower the lights. Perhaps not too low. Ancient Egypt already has enough curses without us helping. When most people think of ancient Egypt, they imagine towering pyramids, golden masks, mysterious hieroglyphs, and of course mummies wrapped in endless layers of linen. What they often don't realize is that ancient Egypt was also a civilization deeply concerned with invisible dangers. The Egyptians lived in a world filled with gods, spirits, demons, sacred animals, magical words, and supernatural forces that could either protect or destroy a person. To them, magic wasn't fantasy. Magic was simply another part of reality. If the Nile flooded at the right time, that was partly because the gods allowed it. If crops failed, perhaps supernatural forces were involved. If someone became sick, the cause might be a physical illness. Or perhaps an angry spirit had decided to make their week considerably worse. Ancient Egyptians saw the world as balanced between order and chaos. They called this balance Ma'at. Maintaining Ma'at was one of the most important duties of every pharaoh. Because without order, chaos would consume everything. And chaos, according to Egyptian belief, was never far away. In fact, chaos was always waiting. Patiently. Like an extremely unpleasant neighbor. To understand Egyptian curses, we first need to understand how Egyptians viewed death. Unlike many cultures that feared death as a final ending, Egyptians viewed it as a transition. Death was not the end. It was merely the beginning of a very complicated journey. And honestly, ancient Egyptians made the afterlife sound like the world's most difficult bureaucratic process. First, your body needed preservation. Then your soul had to survive various dangers. Then you needed to pass divine judgment. Then you had to navigate supernatural challenges. Then you hoped not to be eaten by a terrifying monster. Only after all that could you enjoy eternal life. Simple. The Egyptians believed every person contained multiple spiritual elements. One was called the Ka. Another was the Ba. There were others as well. Each played a role in existence after death. If the body was destroyed, serious problems could arise. This is one reason mummification became so important. The dead needed their bodies. The dead needed their tombs. The dead needed their possessions. And most importantly, the dead needed protection. Because tomb robbers existed. And tomb robbers had existed almost as long as tombs themselves. Human beings have always been remarkably creative when it comes to stealing valuable objects. Ancient Egypt was no exception. Imagine spending decades constructing an elaborate tomb. You fill it with gold, jewelry, furniture, weapons, food, statues, paintings, religious texts. Everything necessary for eternity. Then some thief arrives 200 years later and decides your eternal resting place looks like an excellent source of quick income. Naturally, Egyptians were not thrilled about this possibility. And so they developed various methods of protection. Some protections were physical. hidden chambers, sealed entrances, massive stone blocks. But other protections were supernatural. This is where curses begin to appear. One famous example comes from tomb inscriptions designed to frighten intruders. These inscriptions often warned that terrible consequences would follow anyone who disturbed sacred burial sites. The wording varied. Sometimes the threat came directly from the deceased, sometimes from the gods, sometimes from supernatural creatures. The message remained remarkably consistent. Leave this tomb alone, or regret it forever. Not exactly subtle. But subtlety was not the goal. Fear was. One ancient inscription reportedly warned that anyone who violated a tomb could face judgment from divine forces. Another threatened punishment from crocodiles, snakes, lions, and other deadly creatures. Considering Egypt already contained actual crocodiles and actual snakes, this threat probably felt fairly convincing. Imagine reading that warning while standing alone in the desert. Suddenly every rustling sound becomes suspicious. Every shadow becomes threatening. Every distant movement starts looking like divine punishment arriving ahead of schedule. Yet curses were not limited to tombs. Ancient Egyptian magic appeared throughout daily life. People carried protective amulets. They recited magical spells. They wore symbols designed to ward off evil. Even ordinary citizens often believed supernatural dangers lurked around them. Many feared hostile spirits. Others worried about magical attacks from enemies. Protective magic became an important part of society. Priests developed extensive knowledge of rituals and sacred texts. Magical specialists offered services to those seeking protection. In some ways, supernatural security was as important as physical security. Perhaps more important. After all, you can lock a door. It's much harder to lock out a curse. Among the most fascinating Egyptian legends were stories involving powerful gods whose conflicts shaped the universe itself. One of the most famous involved Osiris. According to Egyptian mythology, Osiris was a wise and beloved ruler. His brother Set, however, was jealous. Very jealous. The kind of jealous that never leads anywhere positive. Set murdered Osiris and seized power. But Osiris's wife, Isis, refused to accept defeat. Using magic and determination, she searched for her husband's remains. Eventually, she helped restore him. Osiris became ruler of the underworld, while their son Horus challenged Set for the throne. The conflict between Horus and Set became one of the central myths of Egyptian civilization. It represented the struggle between order and chaos, good and evil, legitimate rule and destructive ambition. And naturally, it involved enough supernatural drama to fill several modern television series. The goddess Isis herself became one of the most legendary magical figures in human history. Egyptians believed her knowledge of magic was extraordinary. Some stories claimed she gained power through secret knowledge of divine names. To Egyptians, names possessed immense significance. Knowing a being's true name could grant power over it. This idea appears repeatedly throughout Egyptian mythology. Words mattered. Names mattered. Spells mattered. Language itself contained power. It was not merely communication. It was magic. Because of this belief, Egyptians filled tombs with written spells. The famous funerary texts, often called the Book of the Dead, contained instructions for navigating the afterlife. These writings included prayers, magical formulas, warnings, and guidance. Many were designed to protect the deceased from supernatural threats. The afterlife, according to these texts, could be surprisingly dangerous. There were gates to pass, guardians to satisfy, creatures to avoid, challenges to overcome. Ancient Egyptians apparently believed eternity required a considerable amount of paperwork. Then there were demons. Yes, demons. Ancient Egyptian religion included numerous supernatural beings that modern audiences might classify as demonic entities. Some guarded sacred places. Others punished wrongdoing. Still others threatened souls traveling through the underworld. These beings appeared in artwork and religious texts throughout Egyptian history. Many possessed frightening appearances. Human bodies with animal heads. Animal bodies with human features. Creatures combining multiple forms. Ancient Egyptian imagination was extraordinarily creative and occasionally terrifying. Perhaps the most frightening of all was Ammit. Ammit waited during the judgment of the dead. When a person died, their heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at. If the heart balanced correctly, the soul could continue. If not, Ammit would consume it. Imagine surviving death only to discover your eternal fate depends on a supernatural weighing ceremony. And nearby sits a monster waiting for mistakes. Not exactly a relaxing experience. Ammit was often depicted with features from a crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus, which somehow managed to combine three already dangerous animals into something even more alarming. Ancient Egypt clearly had talented nightmare designers. But perhaps no Egyptian legend would become more famous in the modern world than the so-called Curse of the Pharaohs. Ironically, this story emerged thousands of years after ancient Egypt itself. And it began with one of archaeology's most famous discoveries. The tomb of a young king named Tutankhamun. A discovery that would unleash rumors, mysteries, deaths, and enough newspaper headlines to keep the legend alive for generations. And that is where our story will continue in part 2. For now, the desert grows quiet. The torches flicker against ancient stone. And somewhere beneath the sands of Egypt, countless forgotten tombs still wait in darkness, guarding secrets that have remained hidden for thousands of years. Some secrets were meant to be found. Others, according to the ancient Egyptians, were best left undisturbed. After all, when a warning has lasted 3,000 years, perhaps it's worth paying attention. Just a little. Ancient Egypt's most terrifying curses and legends. Part 2, The Curse of the Boy King. Welcome back. The desert wind is still blowing across the sands of Egypt, and somewhere beneath those sands lie thousands of tombs, most forgotten, many looted, and a few still undiscovered. Tonight, we're continuing our journey into the strange world of ancient Egyptian curses and legends. And we begin with perhaps the most famous curse story ever told. The Curse of Tutankhamun. Or, as newspapers would eventually describe it, the curse that hunted down anyone foolish enough to enter the tomb of a pharaoh. A story filled with sudden deaths, frightened archaeologists, mysterious coincidences, and journalists who discovered that ancient supernatural vengeance sold far more newspapers than normal archaeological excavation. Funny how that works. In November 1922, British archaeologist Howard Carter made one of the greatest discoveries in archaeological history. For years, Carter had searched the Valley of the Kings. Most experts believed the area had already given up all its secrets. Ancient tomb robbers had been extremely thorough. Archaeologists had been equally determined. Surely nothing important remained. But Carter disagreed. He believed one pharaoh was still missing. A relatively obscure ruler named Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun had ruled during the 14th century BCE. He became king as a child. He died young. And over the centuries, history had almost forgotten him. Ironically, becoming forgotten may have saved his tomb. After years of searching, Carter's team discovered stone steps buried beneath the desert floor. The steps led downward. Excitement grew. Soon they found a sealed doorway. And on that doorway appeared royal seals. Something extraordinary waited beyond. When Carter finally peered through a small opening into the darkness, he later described seeing wonderful things. Gold. Statues. Treasures. Objects untouched for more than 3,000 years. The tomb was not completely intact. Ancient robbers had entered long ago. But compared to other royal burials, it was astonishingly well preserved. The discovery stunned the world. Suddenly everyone became obsessed with ancient Egypt. Newspapers published endless stories. Museums celebrated. Crowds followed every development. Egyptian-inspired fashion became popular. People decorated homes with Egyptian designs. Ancient Egypt became fashionable in a way its builders probably never anticipated. Imagine spending years constructing a sacred tomb only for future generations to turn your religious symbols into trendy decorations. History can be strange. Then came the deaths. And with the deaths came the curse. The most famous victim was George Herbert, 5th Earl of Carnarvon, often known simply as Lord Carnarvon. He had financed Carter's excavation. Without him, the tomb might never have been discovered. A few months after the tomb's opening, Carnarvon became ill. He died in Cairo in April 1923. Almost immediately, rumors began spreading. Had the pharaoh taken revenge? Had an ancient curse claimed its first victim? The newspapers certainly thought so. Or at least they thought readers would enjoy the idea. Stories quickly multiplied. One claimed that at the exact moment Carnarvon died, the lights of Cairo mysteriously failed. Another story insisted that his dog in England died at precisely the same time. These tales spread rapidly. Some may have been exaggerated. Others may have evolved through repeated retelling. Human beings have always loved dramatic details, especially when ghosts are involved. Soon journalists searched desperately for evidence of a curse. Any unusual event became suspicious. Any death connected to the excavation became part of the legend. People began counting victims. Lists appeared. Books were written. Rumors flourished. The curse became more famous than many actual Egyptian kings, which is quite an achievement. The problem was that the evidence never cooperated particularly well. Many individuals connected to the excavation lived long lives. Howard Carter himself survived for many years after opening the tomb. If the curse existed, it appeared surprisingly inconsistent. Some people died. Many did not. Not exactly the terrifying supernatural efficiency one expects from an all-powerful ancient curse. Still, the legend refused to disappear. And perhaps that's because the curse story touched something deeper. A feeling that disturbing the dead should have consequences. A sense that some places deserve respect. A fear that ancient warnings might contain more truth than we would like to admit. Ancient Egyptians themselves certainly believed in protecting tombs. Whether supernatural punishment actually occurred is another question. but the belief was real. And belief can be powerful. Even today, standing inside a tomb that has remained sealed for thousands of years can create a strange feeling. Not necessarily fear, but awareness. Awareness that you are entering a place built for eternity. A place someone hoped would remain untouched forever. Of course, Egyptian legends extend far beyond tomb curses. Many involve creatures lurking at the edges of the known world. The ancient Egyptians imagined a universe filled with dangerous beings. One of the most feared was Apophis, also called Apep, a gigantic serpent representing chaos itself. And when Egyptians said gigantic, they meant gigantic. Not large snake in the garden gigantic. More like cosmic nightmare attempting to destroy creation gigantic. Every night, according to Egyptian belief, the sun god Ra traveled through the underworld. As he journeyed through darkness, Apophis attacked. Again. And again. And again. Every single night. Apparently Apophis possessed remarkable dedication. The goal was simple. Destroy Ra. Prevent sunrise. Return the universe to eternal chaos. No pressure. Just the fate of existence itself. Egyptians believed priests performed rituals to help Ra win this battle. Spells were recited. Images of Apophis were destroyed. Ceremonies took place. The cosmic struggle between order and chaos was not merely mythology. It was something people actively participated in. Their actions helped maintain the universe. Or so they believed. Imagine waking up each morning and feeling personally responsible for preventing the end of creation. Modern life suddenly seems slightly less stressful. Still others watched silently, judging every approaching soul. To pass safely, travelers needed knowledge. And knowledge meant survival. This helps explain why literacy in sacred texts held such importance in Egyptian religion. Knowing the right words could save your soul. Not metaphorically. Literally. The Egyptians also believed the underworld contained lakes of fire. Now, this sounds suspiciously unpleasant. And indeed, it was intended to be. These fiery regions punished enemies of cosmic order. Those who threatened Ma'at. Those who sided with chaos. For righteous souls, these fires posed little danger. For others, they represented terrifying punishment. Ancient Egyptians clearly believed actions had consequences. Sometimes eternal consequences. But perhaps the most famous scene in the entire Egyptian afterlife was the judgment of the dead. This event determined a person's ultimate fate. And honestly, it was probably the most stressful interview imaginable. The deceased would appear before a divine tribunal. Their powerful gods examined their life. Every action mattered. Every choice mattered. Nothing remained hidden. At the center of this judgment stood Osiris, the great ruler of the underworld, the murdered king who had become Lord of the Dead. Beside him gathered other divine beings, watching, listening, evaluating. Imagine entering a courtroom where the judges are immortal gods. Not exactly an environment that encourages confidence. Then came the weighing of the heart. Ancient Egyptians believed the heart contained a person's moral character, their memories, their actions, their true self. The heart was placed on one side of a scale. On the other side rested the feather of Ma'at, the symbol of truth and cosmic order. If the heart balanced perfectly, the soul could proceed. If the heart proved too heavy with wrongdoing, disaster followed. And waiting nearby was one of the most terrifying creatures in Egyptian mythology. Ammit. Ammit was not a goddess. Nor was she a demon in the traditional sense. She was something altogether more unsettling. A devourer. An executioner. A final punishment. Ancient artists depicted her using parts of 3 dangerous animals. The head of a crocodile. The front body of a lion. The rear body of a hippopotamus. Conveniently combining 3 creatures that Egyptians already feared. As if nature wasn't dangerous enough. If the heart failed judgment, Ammit consumed it. And this punishment carried horrifying implications. The soul would cease to exist. No paradise. No eternal life. No second chance. Simply oblivion. Complete destruction. To many Egyptians, this was worse than any physical punishment. Existence itself would end. Forever. This fear influenced daily life. Egyptians sought to live according to Ma'at. Truth. Justice. Balance. Harmony. These principles shaped society. Not perfectly, of course. Human beings have never been perfect. Ancient Egyptians were just as capable of greed, dishonesty, and selfishness as anyone today. But their religion constantly reminded them that actions mattered. Because eventually, everyone faced the scales. Even pharaohs. Interestingly, many funerary texts include what scholars call the negative confession. The deceased would declare innocence before divine judges. Statements such as, "I have not stolen. I have not murdered. I have not lied. I have not harmed others." The list could be surprisingly extensive. It offers modern historians a fascinating glimpse into Egyptian values. The things they considered morally important. The behaviors they believed threatened cosmic order. Yet even after judgment, dangers remained. The underworld still contained monsters. Serpents. Hostile spirits. Supernatural enemies. The journey toward eternal life required vigilance. The dead carried spells for protection. Magical knowledge remained essential. Because eternity, according to Egyptian belief, involved a surprising amount of danger management. Among these threats were creatures that attacked the sun god Ra during his nightly journey. As we discussed earlier, the greatest of these enemies was Apophis, the giant serpent of chaos. But Apophis was not alone. Other beings served disorder. Other monsters opposed divine order. Together they threatened the stability of creation itself. Every night became a cosmic battle. Every dawn became proof that order had survived once again. The image of the serpent carried special significance. Snakes existed throughout Egypt. Some species were highly venomous. People encountered them regularly. Naturally, these real dangers influenced mythology. A giant cosmic snake felt believable because ordinary snakes already inspired fear. Mythology often grows from familiar experiences. And Egyptians had plenty of experience avoiding creatures that could ruin a day very quickly. Then there were spirits known as the restless dead. These beings appear in various Egyptian writings. Sometimes they sought justice. Sometimes revenge. Sometimes assistance. The boundary between the living and the dead was not always viewed as absolute. The dead could influence the living. the living could communicate with the dead. Relationships continued beyond the grave. At least according to Egyptian belief. Archaeologists have discovered letters written to deceased relatives. People asked dead family members for help. They requested intervention in disputes, protection from illness, guidance during difficult times. Imagine writing a letter to a departed relative and expecting a response through supernatural means. For Egyptians, this was not necessarily strange. It was another part of reality. Perhaps this explains why curses inspired such fear. Egyptians genuinely believed the dead possessed power. Not unlimited power, but enough to matter. Disturbing a tomb risked angering forces beyond human control. And even if a curse never activated, why take the chance? Especially when countless other tombs existed that weren't actively warning you to stay away. Yet despite all these terrifying beliefs, Egyptian religion was not purely pessimistic. Far from it. Most Egyptians hoped for a wonderful afterlife. Fields of abundance. Family reunions. Eternal peace. The dangers existed because the reward mattered. The journey was difficult because the destination was precious. In many ways, their vision of eternity reflected their vision of life. Challenges. Responsibilities. Choices. Consequences. And hopefully, eventual happiness. Still, legends continued to grow. Stories spread. Warnings multiplied. And nowhere did these warnings become more dramatic than in tales surrounding forgotten tombs hidden deep beneath the desert. Tombs said to contain strange treasures. Lost kings. Sacred secrets. And curses powerful enough to survive for thousands of years. In our next chapter, we'll explore some of the most mysterious lost tombs and legendary treasures of ancient Egypt, stories of hidden chambers, vanished pharaohs, and discoveries that continue to puzzle historians even today. Because sometimes, the most terrifying curse is not the one we find. It's the one still waiting to be discovered. To be continued in Part 4. #Ancient Egypt's most terrifying curses and legends. Part 4, Lost Tombs, Hidden Treasures, and the Pharaohs who refuse to be forgotten. Welcome back. Tonight, our journey takes us deeper into the desert. Far from the crowded cities of modern Egypt, beyond the tourist paths and souvenir stands, beyond the cameras pointed at pyramids that have already been photographed millions of times. We're heading toward the places that remain mysterious. The places where archaeologists still dream of making discoveries. The places where ancient Egyptians buried secrets and then spent enormous effort making sure nobody found them. And honestly, if there is one thing ancient Egyptians were exceptionally good at, it was hiding things. Imagine being a pharaoh. You possess unimaginable wealth. You command armies. You build monuments visible for miles. And yet, one of your biggest concerns is that someday a man with a shovel might steal your furniture. It sounds ridiculous, but it was a very real problem. Tomb robbery plagued Egypt for centuries. Even royal tombs were targeted. Gold was gold. Jewels were jewels. And thieves generally cared very little about sacred traditions. The Egyptians responded by becoming increasingly creative. Early rulers built massive pyramids. The idea seemed logical. Construct an enormous stone mountain. Place your tomb inside. Surely nobody will find it. Unfortunately, the giant stone mountain effectively functioned as a sign reading, "Valuable objects buried here." Not ideal. Over time, pharaohs changed strategy. Instead of advertising their burial locations, they attempted to conceal them. This led to the famous Valley of the Kings. A dry, isolated valley surrounded by rugged cliffs. Here, royal tombs were cut directly into stone. The entrances could be hidden. The chambers could be sealed. The location itself offered protection. At least in theory. In practice, thieves remained remarkably determined. Many tombs were robbed despite every precaution. Some were entered within decades of burial. Others survived longer. Few remained untouched forever. This reality frustrated ancient officials so much that surviving records actually describe investigations into tomb robberies. Imagine being an ancient detective assigned to solve crimes involving stolen treasure from a dead king. That's a very specific job description. One remarkable document from ancient Egypt describes widespread tomb robberies during periods of political instability. Investigators questioned suspects. Witnesses provided testimony. Officials documented stolen items. The reports reveal a surprisingly familiar truth. Human beings have not changed very much. People still steal. Governments still investigate. Criminals still make bad decisions. Only the clothing changes. Yet despite centuries of looting, some treasures remained hidden. And these hidden treasures became the foundation for countless legends. Stories spread about forgotten pharaohs whose tombs remained undiscovered. Stories about chambers filled with gold. Stories about sacred objects protected by supernatural forces. Stories that continue today. Because nothing captures human imagination quite like buried treasure. Among the most famous mysteries is the tomb of Nefertiti. Nefertiti remains one of the most recognizable figures in Egyptian history. Her elegant bust is famous worldwide. Her influence during the reign of her husband, Akhenaten, was extraordinary. Yet one major question remains unanswered. Where is she buried? Nobody knows for certain. And that uncertainty has inspired decades of speculation. Some researchers have suggested her tomb remains hidden somewhere within the Valley of the Kings. Exciting theories emerge suggesting secret chambers may lie behind known tomb walls. New scans are conducted. New investigations begin. New hopes rise. Then evidence proves inconclusive. And the mystery continues. Nefertiti remains elusive. 3,000 years later, she is still keeping secrets. Ancient Egyptians would probably appreciate that. After all, keeping secrets was practically a national pastime. Another legendary figure surrounded by mystery is Akhenaten himself. Few pharaohs transformed Egypt as dramatically. Akhenaten attempted something extraordinary. He promoted the worship of a single supreme deity known as Aten. This challenged long-established religious traditions. Temples changed. Art changed. Politics changed. Everything changed. And many Egyptians were not thrilled about it. After his death, officials worked aggressively to erase his legacy. His monuments were dismantled. His name was removed from records. His memory was targeted. Historians sometimes call this a form of ancient damnatio memoriae. The deliberate destruction of someone's public memory. Essentially, the ancient equivalent of being unfollowed by an entire civilization. Despite these efforts, Akhenaten survived history. Enough evidence remained. Enough clues endured. Enough ruins persisted. Today, scholars continue debating his life, his motives, and his ultimate fate. His tomb was discovered, but mysteries remain. And wherever mystery exists, legends quickly follow. Then there are the stories surrounding hidden chambers beneath famous monuments. For generations, people have speculated about secret rooms beneath the pyramids. Lost libraries, hidden treasures, ancient knowledge, forgotten passages. Most of these stories lack convincing evidence. But they persist. Because mystery is powerful. Sometimes more powerful than facts. The Great Pyramid in particular attracts endless speculation. Even after centuries of study, it continues to fascinate people. How was it built? Why was it built in exactly that way? What remains undiscovered inside? These questions inspire books, documentaries, debates, and occasionally some truly astonishing theories. Ancient aliens are practically guaranteed to appear sooner or later, which must be deeply frustrating for the engineers who actually built the thing. Imagine spending decades hauling stone blocks under the Egyptian sun. Then thousands of years later someone concludes extraterrestrials probably did all the work. Not exactly the recognition you hoped for. Yet the pyramids themselves generated supernatural legends even in ancient times. Their enormous scale inspired awe. Visitors described them with wonder. Foreign travelers carried stories back to distant lands. Over centuries, myths accumulated. The pyramids became symbols not only of royal power but of mystery itself. Another fascinating legend concerns hidden books of magic. Ancient Egyptian stories occasionally mention sacred texts containing extraordinary knowledge. One famous tale involves the so-called Book of Thoth. According to legend, this magical book contains secrets beyond imagination. Those who read it could supposedly understand animals, gain immense wisdom, and unlock supernatural abilities. Naturally, nothing ever goes smoothly in stories involving forbidden knowledge. In the tale, obtaining the book brings disaster. The seeker acquires incredible wisdom. But terrible consequences follow. Loss, suffering, misfortune. It's a familiar theme found throughout world mythology. Knowledge without wisdom can become dangerous. Power carries responsibility. Ancient storytellers loved this lesson. And honestly, modern storytellers still use it constantly. Egyptian legends also spoke of haunted places, abandoned temples, forgotten tombs, ruined monuments reclaimed by the desert. Such locations inspired fear and fascination. The desert itself contributed to these stories. At night, strange sounds echoed across empty landscapes. Wind moved through ancient ruins. Shadows shifted beneath moonlight. A vivid imagination could easily transform ordinary experiences into supernatural encounters. And humans have always possessed vivid imaginations. Many travelers recorded strange experiences near ancient sites. Unusual noises, feelings of unease, unexpected events. Most likely, natural explanations existed. But legends rarely depend on certainty. They thrive on ambiguity. A mysterious sound becomes a ghost. A coincidence becomes a curse. A rumor becomes a legend. And eventually, a legend becomes part of history. Perhaps that's why ancient Egypt remains so captivating. The civilization produced extraordinary achievements. Monumental architecture, advanced administration, remarkable art, complex religion. But alongside these accomplishments existed mystery. Questions without answers. Stories without conclusions. Legends without clear origins. And sometimes those mysteries are more interesting than solutions. After all, once every question is answered, wonder begins to disappear. The ancient Egyptians understood this better than most. They built monuments meant to inspire awe. They filled tombs with symbolic mysteries. They wrapped their beliefs in layers of meaning. They created a civilization that still fascinates the world thousands of years later. Not bad for people who lived before electricity. But our journey is not over. Because in the next chapter, we'll explore some of the strangest supernatural creatures and magical practices ever recorded in ancient Egypt. Creatures that haunted dreams. Rituals intended to control fate. And spells that Egyptians believed could protect them from dangers both real and imagined. Because in ancient Egypt, magic was never just a story. For millions of people, it was a way of understanding the universe itself. And that's where we'll continue in part 5. To be continued. #Ancient Egypt's most terrifying curses and legends. ## part 5, the dark magic of ancient Egypt. Welcome back. Tonight, we're leaving behind the royal tombs and hidden treasures for a moment. Instead, we're entering a world that every ordinary Egyptian knew existed. A world of spells, charms, curses, protective amulets, magical creatures, and unseen dangers. A world where magic wasn't considered fantasy. It was simply part of life. And honestly, if you lived in ancient Egypt, you probably would have believed in magic too. Because from their perspective, the evidence seemed to be everywhere. The Nile flooded on schedule. The sun crossed the sky every day. The stars moved with remarkable precision. Children were born. People became sick. Storms appeared. Crops failed. Good fortune arrived unexpectedly. Disaster arrived unexpectedly. The universe felt alive. And magic helped explain why. To modern people, magic often means wizards waving staffs and shooting colorful beams of light. Ancient Egyptians would have found that interpretation amusing. For them, magic was far more practical. Magic protected homes. Magic healed illness. Magic defended against evil spirits. Magic helped mothers during childbirth. Magic kept dangerous creatures away. Magic assisted the dead in reaching eternity. It was woven into nearly every aspect of life. The Egyptians even had a word for magical power. They called it Heka. Interestingly, Heka was not merely a force. It was also a divine being. To Egyptians, magic itself was a fundamental part of creation. The gods used it. Humans used it. The universe depended upon it. Without Heka, existence itself would struggle to function. That's a remarkably elevated status for something modern people often associate with stage tricks and fantasy novels. Priests became the primary guardians of magical knowledge. Temples housed sacred texts. Ritual instructions. Ancient formulas. Protective prayers. Knowledge accumulated over centuries. Some of these writings contained surprisingly practical advice. Others involved elaborate rituals that would seem extremely strange today. And a few were undeniably creepy. One common concern involved protection from snakes. This fear was entirely reasonable. Egypt contained numerous venomous species. A snake bite could easily become fatal. As a result, magical texts often included spells against serpents. Some invoked divine protection. Others attempted to command snakes directly. The idea was simple. If you knew the correct words, you might survive. And when the alternative was a venomous bite, people were willing to try almost anything. Scorpions generated similar anxiety. The Egyptian desert contained plenty of them. Consequently, protective magic became extremely popular. Families carried amulets. Parents recited prayers. Priests prepared protective formulas. Fear and faith worked together. The result was a rich tradition of magical practices designed to make everyday life slightly less terrifying. One of the most beloved protective figures was the dwarf god Bes. And if you're imagining a majestic, elegant deity like those seen in many ancient religions, think again. Bes looked unusual. Very unusual. He was often depicted with a broad face, protruding tongue, bowed legs, and a wild appearance. At first glance, he seems more likely to startle children than protect them. Yet Egyptians adored him. Bes protected households. He guarded pregnant women. He defended infants. He frightened away evil spirits. His unusual appearance was intentional. Monsters feared him. Demons avoided him. At least according to Egyptian belief. Apparently the best defense against frightening creatures was an even stranger creature. An interesting strategy. Another protective deity was Tauret. Unlike many Egyptian gods, Tauret looked absolutely unforgettable. She combined features of a hippopotamus, crocodile, lion, and human. Now, this may sound terrifying. And it was. But terrifying in a helpful way. Tauret protected mothers and children. She guarded households. She defended the vulnerable. Ancient Egyptians saw strength and protection in her fearsome appearance. What's fascinating is how these beliefs reflected everyday concerns. People worried about childbirth. They worried about disease. They worried about accidents. The gods and magical practices they embraced often addressed those fears directly. Religion wasn't separate from life. It was part of life. Of course, not all magic was protective. Some spells aimed to harm enemies. And this is where things become a little darker. Ancient texts describe rituals intended to weaken opponents, punish wrongdoers, or influence events. One famous practice involves something historians call execration rituals. The name alone sounds unpleasant. Because it was. In these rituals, the names of enemies were written on clay figures or pottery. The objects were then smashed, buried, burned, or otherwise destroyed. The symbolic act represented the defeat of those enemies. The logic was straightforward. Destroy the representation. Damage the enemy. Simple. Or at least simple if you believe magic can influence reality. Archaeologists have discovered many such objects. Some contain lists of rival rulers, foreign kingdoms, political enemies. The practice appears to have been surprisingly common. Apparently, writing your enemy's name on an object and smashing it was therapeutic even 4,000 years ago. Human nature remains wonderfully consistent. Ancient Egyptian magic also relied heavily on names. Names possessed extraordinary power. Knowing a being's true name granted influence over it. This belief appears repeatedly in myths and magical texts. The most famous example involves the goddess Isis. According to legend, Isis wanted access to the secret power of the sun god Ra. To achieve this, she needed his true name. A difficult challenge. After all, supreme gods rarely share sensitive information. The story is wonderfully dramatic. Isis creates a magical serpent. The serpent bites Ra. The poison spreads. Ra suffers. The other gods cannot help him. Finally, Isis offers a cure. But only if Ra reveals his hidden name. Eventually, he agrees. Isis gains tremendous power. The lesson is clear. Knowledge matters. Names matter. Words matter. Perhaps more than weapons. This idea influenced countless magical practices. Spells frequently invoke names. Protective texts listed divine titles. Priests memorized sacred words. The correct phrase spoken correctly could alter outcomes. Or so people believed. Whether effective or not, the belief itself shaped behavior across centuries. Dreams also occupied an important place in Egyptian thought. The Egyptians paid close attention to dreams. Some considered them messages from gods. Others viewed them as warnings. Still others saw them as glimpses into hidden realities. Dream interpretation became a respected practice. Special texts explained what certain dreams supposedly meant. And some interpretations were surprisingly specific. Dreaming about particular animals might indicate good fortune. Other animals signaled trouble. Certain actions predicted success. Others warned of danger. It's remarkably similar to dream traditions found throughout human history. People everywhere have looked for meaning in the strange stories created by sleeping minds. Nightmares inspired particular concern. Many Egyptians believed hostile forces could attack during sleep. Protective amulets often remained nearby. Prayers might be recited before bed. Magical objects could be placed around sleeping areas. Because if demons were wandering about in darkness, it seemed wise to prepare. Whether the demons existed or not. One thing becomes increasingly clear as we explore these beliefs. Ancient Egyptians did not divide reality into neat categories. Religion, magic, science, medicine. These fields overlapped constantly. A physician might prescribe practical treatment alongside a protective spell. A priest might offer spiritual guidance alongside medical advice. The boundaries were fluid. And from their perspective, that made perfect sense. Yet among all the magical practices of ancient Egypt, none inspired greater fear than curses directed against tomb robbers. Because while ordinary spells addressed everyday concerns, tomb curses promised something far worse. Punishment beyond death. Punishment delivered by supernatural forces. Punishment that could follow a person forever. And in our next chapter, we'll explore the most frightening curse inscriptions ever discovered, the terrifying punishments they threatened, and why even modern archaeologists sometimes felt uneasy reading them. After all, one thing is certain. If an ancient Egyptian took the time to carve a warning into stone for eternity, they probably hoped someone would read it. To be continued in part.